Welcome to fourth grade history. We are looking at pages 230 and 231. You'll also have a quiz on Monday. So on Monday, your quiz is over pages 228 to 231. So what we're going to be finishing covering today, so 228, there at Preserving Freedom. So this is going to be on the presidents from what happened during the presidency of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and now Ronald Reagan. Well, Jimmy Carter was before him and Ronald Reagan. And of course, it's not everything, but it's what's in these pages. So if you haven't already, I would encourage you to get a highlighter or some way to mark some things in here, things that are underlined, things that are bold, as well as the definition to them. And just those will help you with studying to highlight those things that are important on these pages, okay? So, a return to patriotism and family values. Ronald Reagan came against Jimmy Carter. He was the president that was coming up for re-election. And so Jimmy Carter, of course, had his campaign, and he was running on the same way that he got in, but many of Americans were looking for a change. They were looking for the country to be strengthened, for it to return to traditional values, and that's what Ronald Reagan was saying. And he became known as the great communicator because he seemed to say what many Americans felt in their hearts, that we needed to be stronger, we needed to turn back to our traditional Christian values, and really to end the killing of unborn children, the abortion. And so this was one of his big pushes was for that. And because the American people were on his side, he won the election easily. And so he had a belief, and it's called the Reagan Doctrine, that we should stop communism before it could attack and enslave a country. And so that was this idea, the Reagan Doctrine. And he put this into practice in 1983. Cuba was trying to attack and take over other nations, other island nations. One of those nations was called Grenada, the island of Grenada. And so they came up against them, and the people from Grenada called out, and other island nations called out to the U.S. and said, please help us. And, this time, when there was a plea for help, we had a president in there that was ready and willing to take action against it. And now, I'm not saying that Ronald Reagan did everything correctly and that he had the correct beliefs all the time, but in this thing, and in several other things, he was correct. And so American forces and troops from several other neighboring islands came, and they quickly defeated the Cubans, and they liberated or freed Grenada from communism. Communist power was weakening, but the Soviet Union was still communist and was still trying to fight against being liberated. The government that was in charge wasn't wanting to really let go of that control, and so communism was but it was weakening because they were running out of money, and they had spent so much money building weapons and promoting communism that they had little money for providing food and shelter and clothing for its people. And so many of people in Soviet Union were just very dissatisfied with the communist system and very, very displeased with it. And so in 1987, President Reagan visited the Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, and they were they were talking about how America their military had been strengthened under President Reagan, and they were developing weapons that would actually defeat, that the Soviet Union couldn't defeat. These new weapons were so strong. And so Mikhail, in his attempts to not start more war with the US, promised that he would reduce the number of weapons that they were creating, and he was going to free the countries of Eastern Europe and stop encouraging communism around the world. And so we helped to rebuild their economy and to establish a government with more freedoms. And so it continued to collapse because this was not a strong government at all. And even with the US help, their hold on everything, the Soviet Union just was collapsing. And so it actually no longer exists as a nation. We don't call it the Soviet Union anymore. There is the Republic of Russia, and Boris Yeltsin was the man that really turned it around and became and made it a free nation. And then we helped all the smaller countries that had been freed develop republics, free governments that were not controlled by communism. And so we had other countries helping us, and this Cold War between our nations had ended because of their desire to change. And so we didn't really have that war with them any longer. And so it did end communism in the Soviet Union, but it didn't end communism altogether, and some people thought that, oh, that's the end of communism, but it's not, because China was pretty much overrun by communism at this point. And they still have a lot of communist hold in China. And so communism is still a part of the world, and is still trying to get more nations to be communist, and there is some of that, but the Soviet republics, those free nations that came out of the Soviet Union, joined together and developed the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS. And at this point, there were many Christians that stepped up and tried to bring the gospel into these areas that the people had been persecuted. And you remember that communism is atheistic, and so a lot of these people grew up hearing that there was no God. And so that was one of the big pushes, was to bring the gospel into these nations where there was really no God there before. There wasn't, they didn't know about the one true God. And unfortunately that was true in these nations, but now they were able to freely hear the word of God. And so that was a blessing. All right. So I want you to go ahead and read these pages, page 230 to 231 of that comprehension check. Go ahead and do that comprehension check on paper. I am going to ask the comprehension check questions from last time. On page 230, the top page, the 5 questions. What was the long conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union called? The long conflict between the US and Soviet Union? The Cold War, okay? What communist dictator took control of Cuba in 1959? Fidel Castro. Which president was shot and killed while traveling in a motorcade in downtown Dallas? John F. Kennedy. Very good. Which president withdrew troops from Vietnam? Was Richard Nixon. All right. And what incident forced President Nixon to resign from office? What was it called? The Watergate affair. And it was because they were stealing confidential documents from the Watergate building is how that name came about. All right. So I want you to make sure that you read this and answer those 2 questions on paper. Actually, there's kind of 3 questions in it. And then study pages 228 to 231 for your quiz on Monday. And you have a health test next, so there isn't a video, but after that, you should be done for the week. And so enjoy your weekend, and we will see you next Monday.